All right, so here's the next project. We have a 91 Pontiac Firebird. We're gonna do a full suspension system to it, upgrade polyurethane bushings, new springs, shocks, the works. Let's get her started. A quick look at what we have planned to install here is front and rear springs, front struts, front strut mounts, rear shocks. We have sway bar kit from Energy Suspension, along with their HyperFlex system, which is front and rear control arms and sway bar. Should make this thing handle great. So here's a quick look at the rear suspension, the stock stuff that was in here. As you can see, they got coil spring expanders shoved in here, trying to lift the rear up. We're gonna go ahead and replace the control arm bushings in here, the bushings in this bar, the rear shocks. These control arm bushings are gonna be replaced. We're gonna replace the front springs with new ones. We're gonna redo sway bar bushings, and then we're gonna put new struts and mounts in the front. So should make this thing handle great. The rest of the suspension seems to be in good shape. If we see any problems when we take things apart, we'll replace it then. So starting in the rear, how I'm gonna do this is we're gonna get the springs out of here first, and then we're gonna get the control arms out and redo them one at a time. The spring is held in by the shock. So what we have to do is remove the lower shock off of the shock mount here. The inside you have to take apart to get to the top of the mount. It's in underneath the carpet in the back. But we're gonna get tension off the springs before we start taking the control arms out. We're gonna leave the rear end installed, so we're gonna kind of do them one at a time. How I started was, well, one, I supported the rear end with the jack. If you're on the ground, you'll have to hold this up so that the spring doesn't pop out of here. And then I pulled the shock off. You can see how junk the shock is because it went all the way back up inside and stayed. But now we can take tension off of the spring and lower it down, and we'll be able to pop the spring right out of there. Okay, and just like that, I was able to just pull the spring out. Sometimes you'll have to take this loose first in order to get it to drop down low enough. But I was able to just basically remove the shock and pull the spring. The spring actually comes out pretty easy. Now comes the fun work of trying to get these old rusty bolts out of these control arms without breaking them off or having the rust make them spin inside the bushing. So let's see what we can do. And here's a side-by-side comparison. We are going back to stock ride height, but you can see how much this spring has sagged. Just set them up this way. So pretty much without fail, as I expected, the bolts completely froze in the bushing. So the only thing I have is good news is I don't have to worry about heating the bushing and ruining it because we're gonna replace it anyway. But yeah, bolts totally froze in the rubber. That always makes it fun. All right, so after working at it for a while, I finally got the first control arm out. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna take and press out this entire bushing, including the shell. And then we have new ones to install. So let's get that started. Okay, so how I push the bushing out is I put some metal sleeves in here to keep the control arm from getting crushed as we put pressure to push the bushing through. I'm also gonna take the air chisel and I'm gonna dimple the bushing here and dimple it here just to make it pop out a little bit easier. And then I'll just step back and hit it with the impact and it'll drive the bushing right out. Okay, so you can see I took my air chisel and I put a little dimple here and here to loosen up the bushing to get it pushed out. And I can do this one-handed. Boom, bushing pops right out. Okay, so picked up my metal sleeves that I took out of there. Back this off a little more. And as you can see, the bushing, those two little dimples just make it come out a little easier. And so now we're gonna go ahead and press the new one in. And then to press it back in, I set my press up with just the sleeve, so that way I'm pushing the sleeve right back in. And I still separate it with these two bushings to keep it from crushing. Just like that, the new sleeve's installed, and we'll get the bushings lubricated and pushed in when we go to put it back on the car. Let me get the other side done now. To finish up the control arm bushing replacement, once you have your sleeve completely pressed in all the way, you have a bushing, a center pin, and then this bushing goes on the outside of the arm like this. So yeah, once you get your pin all coated in grease, you can easily just compress it in with a channel locks or your hand or a bench vise, however you got to do it. But seat the pin all the way down. And then this outer piece will sit over the outside of the bushing like that. We'll go ahead and get it installed in the car. Quick pass in the sandblaster cleans up the rusty bolts pretty well. We're gonna hit them with a little ANICs so they don't seize up in the future. So to get the top of the shock removed from the body, you have to fold the seat forward and pull this piece of carpet out. And underneath these foam plugs is the top of your shock. So we're gonna go ahead and get the shocks unbolted from in here. There's the plug on that side. Okay, so you can see the shocks are completely collapsed still, even after I've taken them off the car and they've been sitting here for a while. That's why we're replacing them. And this is the replacement unit, KYB gas adjust. Should make this thing handle pretty good. So the panhard bar takes a different style bushing. Instead of having a metal sleeve that gets pressed into the bar, the bushing here just gets completely removed. And this outer metal casing is the outside sleeve. So it's just the bushings get pressed in, and then their two pieces get pressed together, and that fixes this bushing. Okay, so to press this bushing, what I have to do is I go around and I chip away the outside of the bushing so that this metal adapter will fit the outside metal, and I'm gonna press it this way with the ball joint press. So this is how I set it up. I'm gonna go ahead, drive my press in. It's gonna push the bushing right out for me. As you can see, the press pushed it that far out for me. All I have to do now is just wiggle it the rest of the way out. Okay, and again, to install these bushings, it's simply in the actual sleeve itself of the arm. You put the two rubber bushings in, and then you put your pin in the center. To start the front suspension, what we're gonna have to do is remove our sway bar link completely from the bar, pull this outer tie rod and nut, and we're gonna have to get in here and get this ball joint nut off too. When we separate the ball joint on this, the coil spring does have pressure on it, and there's no shock to stop it. So you must support the lower control arm when you go to knock the ball joint loose, otherwise the spring will take off on you. So let's get that started. So under here is the bolt that holds the strut to the mount. And so you have to take the mount off the strut before you take the strut out, and then the mount comes obviously off the top. The ball joints don't want to separate for me right now, so I think what I'm going to do is support the spring and take the strut out of this side connected to the steering knuckle, and then I'll unbolt the shock, or unbolt the strut off the steering knuckle and kind of leave that all attached and see if I can take it out in one piece. So yeah, with our cap popped off, this is the bolt we're going to take out. I'll get a jack underneath here and get this supported. Okay, so I've disconnected the caliper and I got it supported with a chunk of wire and hung up so that the hose isn't being pulled on. Sway bar link's off, tie rod is disconnected. The ball joint is still connected at the moment, but what I'm going to do here is use the impact to run the strut and get the nut off. Okay, so I went ahead and pulled the nut off, and the strut collapsed straight down on, so no air pressure left in that, or gas pressure left in the strut here. Completely collapsed down. So I'm gonna go ahead and raise the vehicle to allow that coil spring to start to get tension off of it. Okay. I think I'm gonna go ahead and get the strut out of my way right now. No, think we're okay. But I'm gonna get 2 hands so I can hold that spring so it doesn't go flying. Okay, what I did here while I'm taking tension off is I stuck my pry bar through the control arm and through the spring. So if the spring wants to jump, the pry bar should catch it. And it's gonna take a little persuading to get out of there anyway, but yeah, we'll pry the spring out of there and it'll pop right out for us. Okay, so a bit of safety and a bit of overkill here. I took a strap and strapped the spring so that way it's still loose so I can get it out of there, but it can't go flying on me and hit something or hit me. But we're gonna get behind the spring here. Ooh, just like that. Probably is a good thing it was on there. That might have came and smacked me in the face. So the comparison on the front springs, the actual OE spring was a tad higher. However, this is a heavy duty spring, and this is about a 16 millimeter, and this is about 17.5 millimeter thick coil. So you can see the coils are actually starting out closer together, and these ones are more spread out. So this spring, even though starting off a little bit shorter, should give us a little bit taller ride height and a little bit firmer ride, as this is considered a heavy duty spring for this application. Well, my plan to leave this all one piece and just take it all off and pull the strut off the spindle isn't gonna work. I can't get these bolts to budge. I'm gonna have to pull the rotor so I can get these nuts off, and then I can drive the bolts out. They won't move at all, so makes it less fun. I think the other side I'll take the rotor off first so that I'm not working on it in such a weird angle, but that's where we're at. All right, so after I got the rotor and the backing plate pulled off, I was able to get both nuts off, and now I should be able to just drive these bolts right out the back. So I assume my air chisel would be able to take those out, but they're not budging. So I'm either gonna have to pull this off and put it in the press, or else use my ball joint press. So I did end up separating the ball joint and just pulled the spindle and strut off. I'll go ahead and get those bolts pressed out of there so we can get the new strut pressed on. It'll just make it easier for working on this. Ball joint's in great condition, so we're not gonna worry about replacing it. But we are gonna get these bolts out of here and get the bushings replaced inside there. So I tried using my ball joint press to press the studs out of the bolts out of the strut and the spindle, and they're not budging. I'm thinking I'm gonna have to put some heat on these or put them in the hydraulic press. I got a little lucky on this one. Unlike the rear, these bolts actually spin free, and I can actually remove them, so I don't have to beat on them for half an hour. So we'll still sandblast it and I-seize them just to make sure they don't season the new ones, but control arm's almost off. We'll get it out of there and pull those bushings. Okay, so on the rear, I showed you how I dimpled the bushing to get it out. I don't know how well the camera shows it, but this bushing, the case has actually been flared up, so it's larger than the bore. So I'm gonna have to go around and beat this edge all the way around to make sure it's small enough that it can be pushed out. Because we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna replace the sleeve on this, and it pushes this way, but to keep it in place, the factory must have mushroomed this over to hold it. The other side doesn't really have that, so we'll put a small dimple on the little edge that sticks through, and we'll dimple it across here. Same thing here, we'll dimple all the way across, but on this edge, I'm gonna have to remove all of this with either a grinder or I'll take a punch and beat it all down. But that's something you gotta watch out for. You can't press the bushing out if it's mushroomed over like that. So you can see here, I took the air chisel and I dimpled the line just to make it a little less stuck on the actual control arm. Next most important thing is when you go to press this, you don't want to crush it. And where are my bushings? Okay. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna insert these steel bushings. I'm gonna tap them into place so they stay there. And then as we press it, this will keep these bushings, we'll hold this apart and keep it from getting crushed together by the press. All right, I got a steel bushing and a socket holding this apart. So now we should just have to use the press. Oh, it started to move. Just like that. Bushing pops out. We'll reverse the procedure and push the new one back in. All right, so you can see I took my chisel and I dented the whole side of the case, and then I went around and I knocked the edge all the way in on this bushing. Put a couple of the ball joint adapters to keep it from crushing, and this one should press out just as easy as the other side did. Reposition the tool, but it's already starting to move. You can see it's moved that far. I'm going to reposition it so that the tool's not hitting the control arm. All right. It's pushing itself right out. No problems. To install it, I did basically the same thing, just reversed it and use a couple bushings to keep it from collapsing again and press the new sleeve in. Okay, we got both sleeves installed on this control arm. All right, so we got two different size bushings with two different length pins. We're gonna go ahead and push the bushings into the collars first, and then we're gonna cover the pins in grease, and we'll lubricate the outside surface here, the surface here, and the pins. That way they can float, and if they do, as they move up and down, they're not gonna be squeaking and creaking. The pin gets all greased up, and then with just a large channel locks, I go ahead and I squeeze the pin in. All right, so with the pin seated, you're gonna wanna make sure you get the grease smeared all over the face of these bushings, because as it rocks up and down, that's gonna rub on the frame. And just coat the whole face. Much harder to get grease in there after the fact, so get it all good and lubed up. All right, this control arm's ready to put back in, and we'll get the strut. We still got to press the strut off the spindle, but we'll get this side put together. Okay, yeah, for this side I did do it a little differently. I went ahead and just disconnected the lower ball joint and left the strut hanging. Went ahead and strapped my spring in, which I think I got too much tension on my strap. I might have to loosen that a little bit, but we'll go ahead and we'll get the spring popped out of here. So whenever you take the mount off, you're definitely gonna have to have an alignment done. But what I do is I take it off and then I line it back up to exactly where it was at before, and then tighten the bolts up so that way you're as close to aligned as you can be before you throw the strut in it. That's the new mount installed. All right, from this position here, I can already tell there's a 0% chance that I'm getting this spring to pop into this groove without first compressing the spring with the coil spring compressor. So I set it up here on the tranny jack to see if I'd be able to get back here with the pry bar and maybe get it popped in there, but this spring's gonna be way too stiff. So Pete the cat's kind of checking things out today. So that's the spring with the coil spring compressor installed. You can see kind of pulled this corner a little closer, so it should make it a lot easier to get it in there. Hopefully I have it compressed enough. All right, so I got this side, the nuts all tightened down, springs all mounted in. Go ahead and get the coil spring expander out of the center. Hopefully we don't have it stuck in there too tight. A lot of times it'll get wedged in between the spring and the control arm. You gotta beat it out, so we'll get it apart. Well, that's kind of nice. The other side I had to take off the rotor, take off the backing plate, and ended up heating up the spindle with a torch and hitting it with penetrating oil and an air chisel to get the bolts out. And on this side, they seem to be unscrewing. So hopefully the bottom one comes out too. So with everything put back together and everything torqued, we got new sway bar links, we have new struts, new strut mounts, new springs, new lower control arm bushings for both sides. The rear, we did the control arm bushings on the lower, the track bar, the springs, and the shocks. I have to put, and obviously she got some brand new tires on her too. Correct size, all four are the same now. So next thing I have to do is put the interior back together where I pulled the carpet up so I could put the shocks in the front or in the rear. And I have to finish torquing the strut mounts on the top. I normally like to wait until I get it at ride height, just so that way it's torqued in the right position. Normally these bushings would be torqued at ride height, but when you're putting polyurethane in there, it functions more of a bearing than it does a bushing. So the center sleeve is allowed to pivot, as opposed to a rubber bushing where the center sleeve is solid and the rubber has to deform when it goes up and down. This will actually just kind of float in there. That's why you wanted to make sure you put grease on it. So I'm gonna hit all these fittings with the grease gun before I put it down, so that way the chassis is all greased up for them. And these are on back order, so we did not replace the front sway bar bushings. And in the rear, we had an issue with the polyurethane ones only come for a 19 millimeter bar. He told me this was 18, and he's right. I actually just assumed it was the 19, and he had measured it off a little bit, but my mistake. So we're gonna have to try and find a new sway bar. I think I have one in a pile of parts somewhere. We'll put that on another day, but that's where she's at. Let's see how it looks on the ground. Here it is, all finished up. New tires, new suspension. Should be a fun little car for him.